The lights burned hot, the hum of cameras a constant reminder that every second counted. The press room was packed tighter than usual, a sea of expectant faces and microphones angled like arrows. In the center, framed by the presidential seal and velvet drapes, stood Vice President Kamala Harris, poised, polished, projecting the image of control. And then it happened. The reporter's voice cut through the murmurs like a blade. "Madam Vice President, when will this administration finally take responsibility for the chaos at the border?" Her smile faltered. Just for a heartbeat, but in the age of viral clips, that was enough. The shift was microscopic yet seismic, a tremor in the facade of composure she had worn for months. Kamala leaned forward, eyes narrowing under the unforgiving glare of studio lights. "I'm not going to sit here and be lectured," she snapped, her tone sharp enough to slice through the silence. "We've done more for immigration reform than anyone giving cheap shots from the sidelines." The room froze. Reporters stopped scribbling. Camera shutters clicked like the ticking of a bomb. Somewhere in the back, a producer mouthed to another, "Did she just—" She wasn't finished. "If you want a grandstand, do it on your own time," she added, voice laced with a brittle edge that no speechwriter could soften. The words hit the floor like shattered glass, jagged, impossible to sweep under the rug. Within seconds, phones lit up, tweets fired off mid-briefing. Kamala snaps. Border meltdown. A clip looped on social feeds before she even drew her next breath. But for the millions watching at home, this wasn't just another tense exchange. This was a crack in the armor, a rare glimpse behind the curated calm of Washington's power corridors. Because this question, this single, simple question, had detonated something deeper, something no one in that room fully grasped yet. And as Kamala Harris straightened her jacket, jaw set in defiance, one truth loomed large. The story had just escaped her control. But what sparked this meltdown wasn't just a question. It was a ticking time bomb for the White House. For days, the headlines had been circling like vultures. The southern border was no longer a quiet policy problem tucked in the back pages of newspapers. It was a storm ripping across front pages and primetime broadcasts. Migrant caravans, overcrowded detention centers, families torn apart under a system cracking under its own weight. Poll numbers were slipping, not just for the administration, but for Harris herself. She was supposed to be the answer, the one tasked with leading a humane solution, a voice for compassion and reform. Instead, critics called her absent, invisible, even indifferent. Behind closed doors, advisors warned her, "This will define you. Handle it wrong, and you'll carry this baggage into 2024. So when she walked into that briefing room, every word mattered. Every expression could become a meme, every pause a headline. She knew the stakes, and so did everyone else. That's what made the reporter's question lethal. It wasn't just about policy. It was about accountability, about credibility, about whether Kamala Harris could withstand the weight of her own promises, and it didn't come from a hostile source. This wasn't a conservative firebrand from a fringe outlet. No, this was a mainstream journalist, respected, measured, the kind of voice that middle America trusts. When he asked, "When will this administration finally take responsibility for the chaos at the border?" it wasn't just a jab. It was an indictment. The question pierced deeper because it tapped into a growing national frustration. For weeks, Americans had been watching images of migrants wading through rivers, of overwhelmed border agents pleading for help. Parents worried about security. Immigrant families prayed for dignity. Both sides felt unheard. And now, the pressure cooker was exploding in real time under the unforgiving glare of live television. What Harris didn't know, what no one in that room could have predicted, was how quickly this moment would metastasize. How it would leap from a clipped soundbite into a cultural firestorm. Because outside those walls, the narrative was already forming. On cable panels, commentators were sharpening their takes. Did the vice president just lose her cool? On Twitter, activists typed furiously, spinning hashtags into weapons. And lurking beneath it all was the question that terrified her. Team, If Kamala Harris couldn't handle a tough question from a reporter, how would she handle the heat of a campaign trail? The stakes weren't just political, they were existential. Careers could implode over a single viral clip. Reputations built over decades could be erased by a 12-second meltdown. And for Kamala Harris, this was more than an exchange. It was a trial, broadcast live, before millions of jurors with itchy thumbs and endless feeds. And the verdict? That would come next. Because the reporter wasn't done asking questions, and Kamala Harris wasn't done answering, at least not yet. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand Kamala Harris. Not the polished sound bites, but the journey that shaped her and the contradictions that shadowed her. Born to immigrant parents, her mother from India, her father from Jamaica, Kamala entered politics draped in the promise of representation. A prosecutor turned senator turned vice president, she embodied a historic narrative. The first woman, the first Black and South Asian American to hold the second highest office in the land. For millions, her ascent was proof that the American dream could still reach the summit. But politics is cruel to those who climb fast. The higher you rise, the thinner the air, the harsher the scrutiny. For Kamala, that scrutiny was relentless. As California's Attorney General, she built her brand on toughness. Smart on crime, she called it. But in an era of criminal justice reform, critics saw something darker. A prosecutor who resisted. Progressive calls to reduce incarceration. A politician accused of prioritizing optics over outcomes. The word ambition clung to her like perfume, sometimes intoxicating, sometimes suffocating. In 2019, she launched her presidential campaign to roaring headlines. She promised boldness, empathy, and a new generation of leadership. For a brief moment, she was the rising star, until the debates. One night in Miami, under the blinding lights, she landed a devastating blow on Joe Biden over his record on busing. The audience gasped, pundits buzzed, donors opened wallets. But behind the applause was a truth no one spoke aloud. Kamala Harris was a fighter who could draw blood. And yet, just months later, her campaign collapsed. Why? Because what played well in a viral clip didn't always translate into trust. Voters struggled to pin her down. Was she the pragmatic prosecutor or the progressive reformer, the fighter or the fixer? To some, she seemed like both, and neither. When Biden tapped her as running mate, it felt like redemption, a chance to rewrite the story. And in many ways, she delivered, energizing key demographics, adding diversity and vigor to a ticket framed as a return to normalcy. But governing is different from campaigning. There are no applause lines in a migrant camp, no easy sound bites when policy meets reality. Biden handed her the border portfolio, a task so politically toxic, insiders called it a poisoned chalice. At first, she approached it with optimism. Meetings with leaders in Central America, pledges of aid, photo ops. But as months turned into years, the numbers told a harsher story. Encounters at the southern border hit record highs. Governors declared states of emergency. Images of overcrowded facilities went viral. The vice president tried to pivot, speeches on root causes, calls for regional cooperation. But the optics didn't budge. Critics mocked her for being missing in action, for that fateful soundbite, "Do not come," delivered with a smile that launched 1,000 memes. Even allies whispered, "Why isn't she down there?" By the time she walked into that briefing room, her approval ratings had sunk like an anchor. The opposition painted her as incompetent. Progressives muttered that she'd lost her edge. And through it all, she clung to one strategy: control the message, keep the composure. Until today. Because behind the polished podium, under the unforgiving lights, all the cracks converged. Years of criticism, months of frustration, and the pressure of a million unseen eyes collided in one reporter's question. She could have sidestepped it. She could have smiled, pivoted, drowned the tension in policy jargon. That's what her staff prayed for. But Kamala Harris didn't pivot. She snapped, and in that instant, everything her team feared became real. The controlled image shattered, and the meltdown began. But here's the thing about power. It never falls quietly. It drags everything with it: reputations, alliances, even the illusion of invincibility, and as Kamala gripped the podium, fire flashing in her eyes, one truth became clear. She wasn't just fighting a reporter. She was fighting the story of her own unraveling. And the reporter? He wasn't backing down. Before the flashbulbs, before the trending hashtags, before millions of eyes dissected every syllable, there was just a man with a notebook and a fire that wouldn't let him stay silent. His name was Daniel Cross, though most viewers only knew him by his byline. Daniel wasn't the loudest voice in journalism. He wasn't the host of a primetime show or a regular on cable panels. He didn't shout to be heard. Instead, he believed in something rarer, that questions could still pierce through spin, that truth mattered even when it was inconvenient, and that the press had a duty, a sacred one, to the people who trusted them. That belief wasn't born in a classroom. It was forged in the dust of El Paso, in the shadows of the border wall, where Daniel began his career covering stories most outlets ignored. He'd walked through migrant camps, listened to families recount journeys through hell for a shot at dignity. He'd seen mothers cradle babies dehydrated from the desert heat. He'd sat across from Border Patrol agents so exhausted they spoke with cracked voices, haunted by choices they never wanted to make. For Daniel, the border wasn't a statistic. It was a wound. And every administration, blue or red, had promised to heal it. Every administration had failed. That's why when Kamala Harris was tasked with fixing root causes, he didn't scoff. He hoped, because deep down, Daniel wanted her to succeed. Not for ratings, not for clicks, for the people he'd met on those dusty trails, the ones whose names never trended, whose pain never made the evening news. But hope has a way of turning into heartbreak when reality doesn't match the rhetoric. Months passed, then years. And what Daniel saw wasn't progress, it was paralysis. He wrote about it, cautiously at first, then louder. He chronicled the photo ops, the diplomatic tours, the carefully curated interviews where no one asked the questions that burned in his gut. When will this administration take responsibility for the chaos at the border? That question didn't come out of nowhere. It came from 1,000 conversations, from promises that rang hollow, from the gnawing fear that the truth was being buried under spin. The morning of the briefing, Daniel stared at his notepad like a soldier checks his weapon before a battle. He knew what would happen if he asked it. White House press access could vanish. Invitations to high-level briefings, gone. Doors that took years to open could slam shut. And yet, as he buttoned his jacket and felt the weight of his press badge against his chest, he knew something else. Silence would cost more than access ever could. Because this wasn't about him. It was about the families waiting in shelters, with numbers scrawled on their arms. It was about the officers standing knee-deep in a system collapsing under politics. It was about the promise of accountability, a promise every American deserved. Daniel didn't walk into that room to grandstand. He walked in to hold power to its own word. But even he couldn't predict what would happen next. He expected deflection. Maybe irritation. He didn't expect the vice president to snap like a brittle branch under too much weight. When her words cracked through the room, "I'm not going to sit here and be lectured." Daniel didn't flinch. He held her gaze, not out of arrogance, but resolve. Because this wasn't personal. It was principle. And in that silence between them, thick enough to feel like gravity, two worlds collided. The polished theater of politics and the raw hunger for truth. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't trade barbs. He simply asked again, steady as a surgeon's hand. "With respect, Madam Vice President, Americans want to know, when will your administration take responsibility?" That's when the room shifted. That's when the tension crystallized into something bigger than a question. Because in that moment, Daniel became more than a reporter. He became a proxy for millions watching from living rooms and factory floors, and border towns, people who felt invisible, people who wanted answers, people who wanted someone, anyone, to ask the question they'd been screaming into the void. And for Kamala Harris, that wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Because when truth walks into a room, power trembles. What Daniel didn't know, what no one could have guessed, was how far this exchange would ripple. How a single question, fired like a shot across the bow, would ignite a firestorm that scorched beyond the walls of that briefing room, and the next strike? It was coming fast, because after the question came the escalation, and neither side was ready for what happened next. The question still hung in the air like a live wire. When will your administration take responsibility? For a heartbeat, no one moved. The click of cameras slowed. The whispers froze. Every journalist in that briefing room knew something rare was happening. This wasn't a soundbite moment. It was the birth of a political earthquake. Kamala Harris leaned forward, the polished calm she wore like armor beginning to crack at the edges. Her lips tightened, her eyes flashing with something between indignation and exhaustion. For months, maybe years, she had endured accusations, deflections, blame, all orbiting the same volatile subject, the border. And now, this reporter, this man, was daring to corner her on live television. Her voice, when it came, was sharp enough to slice through the silence. I will not sit here and be lectured by someone who clearly does not understand the complexity of this issue. Gasps rippled across the room. This wasn't the scripted VP America was used to. This was raw, unfiltered, human, and dangerous. Daniel didn't blink. He had expected pushback, maybe even the icy dismissal politicians often perfected. But this was different, and that difference only steeled his resolve. Madam Vice President, he said, his tone even almost surgical. With respect, Americans don't want lectures either. They want results. 2 years ago, you promised to address the root causes of migration. We're looking at record crossings. How do you explain that? The question detonated like a second blast. Phones in the room lit up. Tweets flew before answers formed. Kamala straightened, her chair scraping softly against the floor as she shifted her weight forward. Her expression hardened, not into anger alone, but into something more layered. Pride, pressure, and the simmering frustration of being underestimated. You think this is simple? She shot back, voice rising, pulling the cameras in like a magnet. You think centuries of instability, violence, corruption, things that predate any administration are fixed overnight? I'm here every day, fighting battles most of you can't even imagine. The words weren't just defensive, they were personal. She wasn't just answering a question. She was bearing a wound, and that made the moment electric. Daniel could have stopped. He could have nodded, backed off, let the storm pass. But something in him refused to surrender, to spin. Not now. Not after years of watching promises dissolve like sugar in water. No one's asking for overnight miracles, he replied, calm but relentless. They're asking for accountability, for transparency, for someone to own the results, not just the rhetoric. That was the spark. The room ignited. Reporters who had been silent now chimed in, their voices overlapping like waves in a rising tide. Is this a failure of leadership? Will the White House change its strategy? Does this fall on you, Madam Vice President? Suddenly, it wasn't Daniel versus Kamala. It was a feeding frenzy, and she was the center of the storm. Kamala's jaw clenched. Her hands gripped the podium. And then, in a moment no one would forget, she fired back words that would dominate every headline for the next 48 hours. You want accountability? Fine. Hold me accountable for fighting a broken system every single day while others stand on the sidelines throwing stones. But don't you dare question my commitment to this country, or to fixing what decades of bad policy left behind. The room erupted, not with applause but with chaos. Reporters shouted over one another, staffers scrambled to restore order, and somewhere in the din, Daniel lowered his pen slowly, the weight of what had just happened pressing on his chest. Because this wasn't just a clash over policy. This was theater. This was war. And the battlefield wasn't the Rio Grande. It was here, under these fluorescent lights, playing out in real time for millions to witness. And as the briefing spiraled beyond anyone's control, one truth crystallized. This was no longer about a question. It was about character, about who breaks first when the pressure turns white hot. Kamala Harris had snapped. But the story was just beginning. Because outside those walls, in the shadow of viral algorithms and political spin machines, a storm was gathering, and its next target? The credibility of an entire administration. By the time Kamala Harris left the podium, the internet had already detonated. Clips of her outburst ripped across social media like wildfire, stitched and reshared with captions that ranged from "iconic queen energy" to "unhinged VP loses it on reporter." Cable news didn't wait for context. Within minutes, prime time, banners screamed, "Harris erupts in border clash. Unprecedented outburst. What does it mean?" CNN's panelists circled like hawks over fresh prey. "Look," one commentator said, gesturing animatedly at the split-screen replay. "This is not your standard VP moment. This is raw, unscripted, and, dare I say, politically dangerous." On Fox, the narrative morphed into a feeding frenzy. "If Kamala Harris can't keep her cool with one reporter," the host sneered, "how can she handle a national crisis?" They ran the clip on loop, slowed down, zoomed in, every eye roll, every syllable analyzed like forensic evidence. Meanwhile, progressives seized the moment with a different kind of energy. Hashtags bloomed across Twitter. Kamala claps back. Speak truth, VP. Border politics. Memes flooded TikTok. Kamala's sharp retort synced to pop beats. Her defiance turned into anthem-worthy content. For millions of young voters, this wasn't a gaffe. It was a vibe. A sign she wasn't afraid to fight. But in the corridors of Washington, the mood was anything but celebratory. Inside the West Wing, aides huddled around glowing screens, faces tight with concern. Every political strategist knew the optics game. Emotion on camera could humanize, or it could haunt. And right now, Harris was walking that razor's edge. News notifications stacked like falling dominoes. Breaking. Harris lashes out at press during tense briefing. WH braces for fallout amid viral VP moment. Then came the think pieces. Opinion pages sharpened their knives. Was this authenticity or instability? Is Kamala Harris the fighter Democrats need, or the liability they fear? And in living rooms across America, the debate turned personal. For some, Kamala's words struck a nerve. Finally, someone pushing back against years of lazy sound bites and simplistic solutions. For others, it was proof of a deeper weakness, a politician cornered, cracking under the weight of unfulfilled promises. Cable news amped the drama into overdrive. Primetime hosts lined up the narrative as if auditioning for a Hollywood trailer. Tonight at 9, what really happened inside that briefing room? Was this a turning point for the Biden-Harris administration? Meanwhile, the clip kept climbing the algorithmic ladder, 50 million views in under 12 hours. Comment sections swarmed with digital gladiators, hurling hashtags like spears. The culture war had found its newest battleground and its newest spark. But behind the noise, a more dangerous truth loomed. This wasn't just about optics anymore. Every reaction, every tweet, every segment was feeding a question too big to ignore. Had Kamala Harris accidentally opened a fracture in the White House shield, or had she ignited a rallying cry that could redefine her political legacy? The answer wouldn't come from pundits, or even from Kamala herself. Because in the shadows, opponents were already plotting their next move, armed with the clip, the outrage, and a strategy designed to turn one viral moment into a political inferno. And as the night wore on, one thing became clear. The battle for the narrative wasn't just starting. It was already out of control. By sunrise, the clip had evolved from a viral sensation into a political migraine. What began as a tense exchange at a press briefing now dominated every conversation from cable news panels to suburban kitchen tables. For the White House, this wasn't just trending, it was spiraling. At 7 a.m., Chief of Staff Ron Klain dialed into an emergency conference call. His tone was measured, but the subtext was unmistakable. Damage control wasn't optional. It was existential. "We need to own the narrative before the narrative owns us," he said, scanning faces on the screen. Press team, senior advisors, Harris's communications director. The problem? The narrative was already running laps around them. Overnight, opposition operatives had weaponized the clip into a talking point juggernaut. Conservative PACs flooded Facebook with ads showing Harris mid-retort, frozen in what they called her meltdown face, overlaid with captions like, "unfit to lead." And yet in another corner of the internet, progressives were busy canonizing her. Instagram feeds gleamed with posts that read, "Finally, a VP with a backbone." Popular. Influencers dubbed the moment Kamala's rebirth. This split-screen reality was a strategist's nightmare, and an opportunity, if handled right. But first, they had to calm the storm inside the building. Harris entered the Situation Room like a woman wearing armor. Her expression was steady, but her aides could feel the tension humming beneath the surface. She knew the stakes. A single outburst had put her under a microscope more intense than ever before. "Let's be clear," Harris began, voice even. "I'm not apologizing for telling the truth." Her words hung in the air, bold, defiant. Then, softened. "But we need to pivot. Fast." The team brainstormed, fingers flying across laptops. Option 1. Frame the moment as passion, not anger. Proof that Harris cares deeply about immigration reform. Option 2. Flood the airwaves with surrogates echoing the line, "Kamala fights for families." Option 3. Push a surprise policy announcement to bury the controversy under substance. By mid-morning, the plan was in motion. Harris recorded a measured video message, not a walkback but a reframing. In a sunlit office wearing a calm smile, she spoke to the camera. "Yesterday, I answered a question bluntly because the stakes are real. Our immigration system is broken, and I will never shy away from that truth." The video hit social media like a counterstrike. Supporters amplified it with hashtags Truth Teller and Jar Harris Strong. News outlets aired the clip alongside her original remarks, creating a narrative of resilience rather than retreat. But for every positive spin, the opposition doubled down. Fox booked 2 former border agents for an exclusive. Kamala's anger proves she's losing control. Meme factories churned out caricatures of Harris with captions like, "Triggered Kamala." The GOP fundraising machine raked in donations. Off the controversy, blasting emails titled, "If this is leadership, America is in trouble." Inside the White House, tension simmered. Biden's senior advisors feared the incident could overshadow the administration's policy wins. "One viral moment shouldn't define us," Klain reminded the team. But everyone knew the truth. In politics, perception often beats reality, and then, just as the spin cycle seemed to settle, a new leak hit the press. A senior staffer, speaking on background, hinted that Harris had been privately frustrated for weeks over the administration's handling of the border crisis. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about a single outburst. It was about cracks in the armor of unity. Cable news lit up with speculative headlines. Tensions inside the White House. VP Harris losing patience. Is the Biden-Harris partnership fraying? The opposition smelled blood. Allies whispered reassurances. And Harris? She kept moving, every step calculated to project calm strength while the world dissected her every glance, every syllable. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the day's battles faded into the hum of late-night coverage, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that could redefine Kamala Harris not just as a vice president, but as a political force fighting for survival in the most ruthless arena of all. And in Washington, when survival becomes the headline, everything else, policy, loyalty, even legacy, becomes collateral damage. Night fell on D.C., but Kamala Harris wasn't winding down. She was gearing up. The viral clip had played on loop for 24 hours, dissected, memed, and magnified until her name was the centerpiece of a political storm. Some called it a gaffe. Others hailed it as a battle cry. But Harris knew one thing. Letting the narrative harden without a counterstrike was political malpractice, so she flipped the script. The first shot fired quietly, an unannounced meeting with her digital team in a cramped West Wing conference room. Phones lit up the table like a runway, every screen glowing with analytics. The VP scanned the data with laser focus, engagement numbers, trending hashtags, sentiment graphs swinging like wild pendulums. "Look at this," her chief digital strategist said, spinning the laptop toward her. "Harris Strong is climbing. TikTok's eating it up. People like that, you didn't back down." Kamala leaned back in her chair, a slow grin forming. For weeks, critics had painted her as aloof, restrained, a politician playing defense. Now, one unfiltered moment had cracked that image wide open. And through that crack, she saw an opening. "What's the first rule of politics?" she asked the room. Silence hung for a beat. Then she answered her own question. "You don't waste a viral moment. You turn it into a movement." The plan was audacious. Stop reacting. Start framing. Instead of walking back her words, Harris would double down with precision. Her team mapped the battlefield in real time. Battleground states, key demographics, influencer allies ready to amplify. The message would be simple, but surgical. Kamala. Harris doesn't snap. She fights. For families. For fairness. For a future that works. By morning, Phase 1 went live. Her Twitter feed, carefully curated for months, exploded with a new tone. Unapologetic, fiery, urgent. The first tweet hit like a lightning bolt. "If telling the truth about a broken system makes people uncomfortable, so be it. I'll never apologize for fighting for what's right." Within minutes, retweets surged into the thousands, comments split between cheers and jeers. But Harris wasn't after universal applause. She was after energy. And she had it. Cable news. Anchors took the bait. Morning panels buzzed. "Is Kamala leaning into the controversy?" Kyron screamed, "Harris strikes back." Progressives flocked to her side, calling it a masterclass in owning the narrative. Even some skeptics admitted she was showing spine. But this wasn't just a tweet storm. The real counterattack came at 11 a.m., when Harris strode into a union hall in Pennsylvania for what was billed as a listening session. Cameras rolled as she greeted steelworkers and teachers, her tone measured, her energy electric. Then mid-speech she pivoted. "Yesterday I was asked a question about the border, and I answered bluntly because families are suffering. Children deserve dignity. And when people want to turn that into a game, I say this: human lives are not a punchline." The crowd erupted. Thunderous applause shook the walls, and in that sound, a new headline was born. "Harris turns controversy into rallying cry." But Harris wasn't finished. She sat down for an exclusive primetime interview that night, a carefully chosen platform with a progressive-leaning anchor who could toss hard questions without ambush. When asked if she regretted her tone, Harris didn't flinch. "Passion is not a flaw," she said, eyes locked on the camera. "It's a requirement when you're fighting for people who have been ignored for too long." The clip rocketed across social media like a guided missile. Hashtags shifted. Sentiment swung. Even mainstream outlets began framing the narrative differently. Kamala Harris, from viral outburst to political momentum. Behind the scenes, the White House breathed a cautious sigh of relief. Polling teams reported a surprising twist. Among younger voters and communities of color, Harris's favorability ticked upward. What critics saw as anger, her base saw as authenticity. In an era drowning in political doublespeak, raw emotion felt like truth. But every victory carries a shadow. While progressives cheered, the opposition sharpened their knives. GOP operatives launched a barrage of attack ads framing Harris as unhinged, splicing her fiery remarks with grainy footage and ominous music. One ad ended with the tagline, "If this is calm leadership, imagine the chaos ahead." The message was clear. Harris might win a battle, but the war was far from over, and then came the twist no one saw coming. Late that evening, a leaked internal memo surfaced online, a memo allegedly detailing a bold new strategy to position Harris as the face of immigration reform heading into the next election cycle. Was it real? A plant? A power play? The memo suggested something seismic. Harris wasn't just cleaning up a controversy, she was using it as a launch pad. Cable news anchors lit up the screen with speculation. Headlines blared, Harris eyeing bigger role? From VP to power broker, is this her moment? The story had mutated from a viral gaffe to a political gambit of epic proportions. And at the center stood Kamala Harris, unapologetic, relentless, a woman who had taken a single spark and turned it into a wildfire. But fires don't just illuminate, they consume. And as the flame spread, one question burned hotter than all the rest. Was this the rebirth of Kamala Harris, or the beginning of her most dangerous gamble yet? When the sun rose over Middle America, the echo of Kamala Harris's counterattack had already reached every corner of the country. From coffee shops in Des Moines to college dorms in Atlanta, the conversation was no longer confined to D.C. It was everywhere, on breakfast tables, in barbershops, splashed across timelines and trending hashtags. Cable news had gone into overdrive. Split screens dominated the morning broadcasts. One side replayed Harris's fiery remark in the Union Hall. The other showed panels of pundits debating whether it was bold leadership or political self-sabotage. The headlines were as polarized as the nation's CNN. Harris channels passion in viral response. Fox News, Kamala unhinged, VP meltdown sparks concern. MSNBC, finally, a fighter in the White House? But the real battle wasn't on TV, it was online. Twitter, or what was left of it after rebranding wars, burned like a wildfire. Where Harris strong trended for the second straight day, but so did Kamala meltdown. TikTok creators pumped out split-screen reactions. On the left, Harris snapping at the reporter. On the right, influencers nodding with captions like, "She's tired of the nonsense." Others turned the clip into memes, pairing her words with everything from rap tracks to Marvel fight scenes. Yet the divide wasn't just digital, it was deeply human. In a Texas diner, a group of ranchers huddled around a muted TV shaking their heads. "She thinks yelling makes her right," one said, biting into his toast. "Typical politician. Blame someone else," another chimed in. Meanwhile, 1,500 miles away in a Detroit cafe, a different scene unfolded. Two young activists, laptops open, grinned at the trending graphs. "Looky, at this engagement spike," one said. "She's finally got fire. About time." Polling agencies scrambled to capture the mood swing. Early numbers showed something unusual. While Harris's negatives spiked among conservatives, her favorability among Democrats, and more importantly, independents under 35, ticked upward. Not by much, but enough to raise eyebrows in campaign war rooms. The late-night shows joined the fray. Jimmy Fallon joked, Kamala Harris snapped so hard even Alexa said, "Playing Rage Against the Machine." The audience roared. But Stephen Colbert took a different tone, calling her outburst a rare, unscripted moment of truth in a political world addicted to spin. And then came the unexpected, a wave of grassroots donations. Overnight, Harris's affiliated PACs saw a surge in small-dollar contributions, most with messages like, "Finally speaking our language." The memo leak, real or fake, only fueled the frenzy. Some donors believed they were backing the birth of a movement. But for every dollar raised, a counterattack brewed. Conservative influencers launched coordinated campaigns labeling Harris as volatile and dangerously emotional. Ads flooded swing state Facebook feeds with ominous black and white clips of her snapping, overlaid with the question, "Is this who you want in the Oval Office?" The clash reached a fever pitch when a conservative firebrand senator went on. A primetime rant. "We don't need a vice president who thinks passion excuses poor judgment. America needs calm, steady leadership, not viral meltdowns." The soundbite dominated the next news cycle. But here's the twist. While the political class obsessed over optics, something deeper was happening among ordinary Americans. To some, Harris's reaction wasn't a meltdown. It was a mirror, reflecting their own frustration with a system that seemed incapable of empathy. Her anger resonated in communities where policy debates had long felt like cold math detached from human lives. Town halls lit up with questions. Why is she the only one talking about dignity for families? Why does the media call it unhinged when a woman shows passion? The gender dynamic became a new flashpoint. Feminist groups rallied, arguing that if a male politician had shown the same fire, it would have been framed as strength. Opinion columns multiplied. Hashtags like "Tom Andrew Passion is Power" gained traction. Harris, knowingly or not, had stumbled into a cultural debate much bigger than immigration or the border, and then the pushback from her own party. Behind closed doors, whispers turned into warnings. Senior advisors worried the VP was becoming the story at a time when the administration needed unity. One strategist was blunt: if this turns into Kamala versus the narrative, we all lose. But Harris seemed unfazed. Her team doubled down, rolling out a new digital series titled "Why I Spoke Up," featuring Harris in candid, unpolished conversations about leadership and accountability. The first episode dropped on YouTube and racked up 2 million views in 24 hours. The gamble was working, or so it seemed. But storms rarely stay contained. The opposition wasn't done, and neither was the press. The next leak, the one no one saw coming, would turn Harris's viral moment into the most dangerous political test of her career.